Welcome to Future Histories. My name is Jan Groß, and it is my great pleasure to welcome Jason W. Moore in today's episode. He is an environmental historian and historical geographer at Binghamton University, where he is professor of sociology and coordinator of the World-Ecology Research Collective. He has written highly acclaimed books such as Capitalism in the Web of Life in 2015, and together with Raj Patel, A History of the World in 7 Cheap Things. This has been a really interesting episode for me, since I was very curious to hear Jason transfer his thinking around the web of life and the world ecology paradigm more broadly into the realm of socialist construction. It was also a highly entertaining conversation, I have to say, since Jason is not only very deep and inspiring in his thoughts, but also seems to have a taste for polemics, and I couldn't help but smile from time to time at some of the little polemic arrows that were being shot in multiple directions throughout the conversation. Some of the thinkers that were at the receiving end of these polemics have actually also been guests in Future Histories, and I will certainly not take sides in this theoretical battle, but instead let you, dear listener, decide for yourself. So you will find links to related episodes in the show notes, but there's one I'd like to really highlight specifically, and that is episode 30 of season 3 with Matt Huber and Kohei Saito on growth, progress, and left imaginaries. And now, please enjoy today's episode with Jason Moore on socialism in the web of life. Welcome, Jason.
Thank you. It's a treat to be here, Jan.
Oh, it's my absolute pleasure. Jason, let's start by introducing some of your basic concepts. You use the term web of life to problematize conceptions of nature with a capital N. What is the web of life, and how does it relate to the concept of nature and related dualisms like the society-nature dualism?
Well, there's a grand way to begin our conversation. First off, the web of life is a way of asking people to unthink the most dangerous concept in the ideological lexicon of capitalism: nature. Nature, as you properly say, with an uppercase N. We forget this today because neoliberal ideology has destroyed our capacity to remember. It has destroyed our capacity to think historically. However, if we go onto, as Marx and Engels would say, the real ground of history, then we move on to the historical emergence of bourgeois ideology, of, above all, the master concepts, what I call ruling abstractions of man, nature, and civilization. And I use the antiquated English man for deliberate reason, because we need to begin to identify this trinity as the core of a bourgeois ideological project that continues to corrupt and degrade and undermine radical thinking about democratic alternatives moving forward. And this is manifestly clear in the empirical history. As Marx and Engels would say, these are empirically verifiable facts. If you look at the actual history of imperialism from Columbus onwards, each time, each empire, what do? They announce that they are the civilizers, that they are going to civilize the savages, those human beings who were part of nature and therefore unruly and wild. Within Europe, this is the story that Silvia Federici tells, the bourgeois forces subordinated and biological females under the sign of nature. That's what gender is. It is a class ideological dynamic of nature. And that's what women's work means. It says, well, women are biologically this way, and therefore they don't need to be paid or remunerated for their labor. So 10 years ago, or longer than that, 12 years ago, when I set about finalizing my book, Capitalism in the Web of Life, I said, of course, there is a biological, geophysical reality. It's not just the biosphere. It includes solar cycles. It includes the wobble of the Earth and orbital variations. It includes asteroids and all the rest of life. And if you say capitalism in nature, you are using this most dangerous word, this way of thinking that germinated and developed with capitalism to critique capitalism, and that simply cannot lead to a socialist alternative for very good reasons. Socialists historically were extraordinarily hostile to all forms of ecologism and environmental determinism. As you may know, Jan, the originator of the term ecology, Ernst Haeckel, was also a proto-Nazi ideologist who co-founded the German Monist League in the early 20th century. And the German Monist League was one of the forerunners of the Nazi formulation of Lebensraum, of living space. This unfortunately continues. This is not an aberration, let me point it out. And this continues to lurk in the backdrop of certainly mainstream environmental politics.
And when someone criticizes the conception of nature with a capital N, as you just pointed out, and the related society nature dualism, some respond by arguing that this would supposedly lead to a form of counterproductive monism that wouldn't allow for distinctions anymore and therefore create a sort of impasse and inability to act. But however, if I'm not mistaken, you are not arguing for an essentialist monism. You even warn that one should not collapse distinctions, and you call this collapsing of distinctions the danger of green holism. And I always had the feeling that there must be a third way, a way that neither proclaims a sort of quasi-essentialist primary level, then often called nature, or turns into a flat ontology, as, for example, in the case of the actor network theory brought about by Latour. So could you maybe help us clear things up with regard to the question of monism? What is monism, and how do you differentiate your position with regard to that?
Yeah, there is a fraudulent and lazy critique of my work that says Jason Moore is a monist, which is by the way, as I just indicated with my discussion of Haeckel, a way of saying that I'm a Nazi. And this is associated with people like John Bellamy Foster, Andreas Malm, Kohei Saito, and they know full well that I didn't argue this, or if they have deluded themselves into thinking that I've argued a monist position, they are guilty of extremely lazy and superficial reading. Let me point out that at the beginning of Capital, this obscure book written by this obscure thinker, Karl Marx, at the beginning of Capital, Marx begins with a kind of a series of observations, one of which is that capital is a relation of man and man and man and nature. And he quotes the Italian scientist Piero Verri as saying, and he quotes him favorably as saying, well, what does capital do? It rearranges the materials of nature. Now, that is, as everybody who studies Marx seriously knows, that is what Marx would call a transhistorical or general abstraction that can never be left on its own, just like the category labor can never be left at the notion of labor in general. Production can never be production in general. There is always a compulsion for Marx and for serious Marxists to apply that to more and more specific historical circumstances or specific determinations. That's why Marxism is so powerful. So, what is at the center of Marx's thinking about this dynamic of humans in the web of life? Let's remember from the very, very beginning of historical materialism, both Marx and Engels, but famously Marx in the Theses on Feuerbach and the early writings in the manuscript, says that we have to begin with a critique of what Marx calls abstract man and abstract nature. He's clearly indicating that these abstractions are the ideological expressions of primitive accumulation. The so-called separation of man and nature or society and nature is the expression in thought of the real material separation of the peasant from the customary relations on the land. That is the process of primitive accumulation, class formation, and therefore class struggle. So this is an ideological, the critique of man and nature is not limited to epistemology, is not limited to ontology. It's not merely a thought abstraction. It is, as Alfred Sohn-Redl would say, a real abstraction. And not only that, it's a ruling idea, as Marx and Engels say. It is a ruling abstraction, man, nature, and civilization or society. So these eco-socialists have really done the world left a profound disservice. And we know that they are doing something fishy because they never want to touch the real ground of history. Again, Marx and Engels' words. That for the historical materialist, we resolve these questions on the real ground of history. And their flight from history, the flight from history of people like Andreas Malm and Bellamy Foster in this particular debate, I don't mean they never talk about history. I mean, in this particular mode of critique, therefore shares essential common ideological ground with Bruno Latour, who is also in a flight from history. Capitalism in the Web of Life was a critique of, amongst other tendencies, the Bruno Latour actor network thinking, which says, well, you know, everything's a network, everything's an assemblage, capitalism is an illusion. Latour says this straight up. Donna Haraway later says, well, when it comes to population, let's stop blaming capitalism. But the fact is that for a historical materialist, we never remain on the terrain of theory. We resolve our theoretical differences on the real ground of history. I think that most eco-socialist, let's call it high theory for lack of a better term, has detached itself from the real ground of history. That is the empirically verifiable patterns of class struggle in the web of life. And that's what not just Capitalism in the Web of Life, but that book and everything that has swirled around it and developed from it emphasizes that we must always return to the real ground of history. Without doing that, our praxis is empty, is one-sided, and prone to fundamental errors of political judgment.
And then there's another term that you introduce in the book, The Web of Life. You use the term oikeos to, and I quote you here, name the system, and you describe it as the relation through which humans act and are acted upon by the whole of nature in our environment making. So I really like this perspective, but it is not easily understood for people unfamiliar with the world ecology paradigm. So could you explain us how you use the term oikeos?
The inspiration was basically this. The environmentalist critique, including the eco-socialist critique, has many different concepts for degradation, the destruction of nature, degradation of nature. Eco-socialists are like the Eskimos with snow, where, you know, the Eskimos, the Inuits have 19 different words for different kinds of snow. Well, the environmentalists have 27 different words for bad things that humans usually, or sometimes capital, does to something called nature or the web of life. What I wanted to do was to put together Marx and Engels' labor ontology, a labor theory of life, with the pulse of life making. So the oikeos names simply what we all know to be true. There is a dynamic, a generative, a multi-layered pulse of life making. We know that life breaks out in the most inhospitable circumstances, from the depths of the ocean to even on asteroids. There can be forms of proto-life breaking out. And that's important for Marxists to realize, that the labor theory of life, as Engels once said, labor created man, that is not a labor reductionism. And it refuses to treat labor as a hermetically sealed world. However, also, as we know, and anybody who has, say, spent time gardening knows, labor is always labor mixed with the earth. Labor is always a mutually determined activity of labor and soil and plants and microbes, and depends on good enough weather, for instance. If historical materialists ignore the pulse of life making, then we end up with a labor reductionism. And a labor reductionism is one sided and then ends up with a very one sided conception of workers' power in practical terms and leads to very one sided strategies. The Cubans, for instance, in the special period, began to figure out modes of integrated pest management that cooperated with the crops they were cultivating, and that they understood as part of that process that there would be an inevitable degree of loss to pests or weeds, that they didn't need to be eradicated. Now, Marx and Engels actually say something really interesting once again about this in the German ideology. They point to cooperation as itself a productive force. So, as we imagine socialist alternatives, this does not mean leaving untouched the capitalist Promethean ideology of an abstract domination of nature, which was always about the domination also of many human beings classified as nature in a logic of super exploitation. So the oikos was a reminder to Marxists of the importance of this. Now, on the other side, if we take the oikos and separate it out from historical materialism, we end up with eco-fascists like Lovelock and the Gaia hypothesis and others. They end up with a kind of eco-fascist nature worship. And that is also, of course, deeply, deeply problematic. Again, we are in a movement of synthesis, I think, and a movement of intellectual possibility for Marxists if we recognize the living pulse of life and the generative role of life. I mean, take the significance of climate changes across the history of class society, most of which before the 16th century were not created by class society. They were created by various dynamics of the Earth system, orbital variations, changes in solar cycles, and so forth. If we can't recognize these, what I call non-dialectical antagonisms, there's problems that human social relations confront that are out of their control. However, how they respond, how groups of humans, how class societies respond to these non-dialectical antagonisms is all about dialectics. That is, Marx and Engels' labor theory of life essentially offers an insight into dialectical and non-dialectical antagonisms, and we need the oikeos, the pulse of life making, and to recognize that without making it another form of nature determinism.
What does all of this that you just sketched, not only in terms of the oikeos, but also with regard to nature with a capital N and this society-nature dualism, what does all of this mean for the concept of social metabolism? Because for many, it is premised on conceptualizing a metabolic process between humans and nature. It is therefore somewhat reliant on the distinction between humans and nature, even though people tend to emphasize that in this conception, humans are both part of and distinct from nature. So there is a kind of dialectical trick at play in order to keep the distinction within an overall unity, which is, I think, what you call soft dualism, but I'm not quite sure about that. So how do you view and use the concept of social metabolism?
Well, metabolism is precisely as I just indicated, a combination of dialectical and non-dialectical forces and relations, antagonisms. That's important to recognize. What's happened in the hands of somebody like John Bellamy Foster, and if you go and look at his very important book, Marx's Ecology, there is a conception of labor in there, but it's a transhistorical conception of labor. So it mixes a transhistorical concept of labor, labor in general. Even let us give him credit, labor under class society, we can assume in general, is then mixed with a specific metabolic antagonism, what he calls the metabolic rift. Now, this is a problem because not because it identifies metabolism, which had been done a long time before. He usefully inserts labor in general, but not the class dynamics of capitalism, not the specificity of labor under capitalism. And that matters quite a bit to our politics. As Marx pointed out, Marx spent his life crafting a historical conception of labor specificity under capitalism. So for Marx, the social metabolism was not something in the ether. It was not something hanging over us all. The social metabolism was a class metabolism. It was a labor metabolism. And of course, as we know, the labor process is irreducibly metabolic. Now, fundamental to the dialectical imagination is the emergence or the activation of new potentialities slumbering within nature. That's directly taken from Marx. That's at the center of Marx's concept of the labor process. But we can only make sense of that if we have a historically specific conception of labor. And to do that, we need a historically specific concept of class formation, especially above all, of bourgeois and proletarian. Now, it turns out that this is not limited, this problem that I just indicated around the specificity of labor and the concept of metabolism is not limited to John Bellamy Foster. So go look at Andreas Malm, author of another very important book, Fossil Capital, and look at his circuit of capital. So he takes Marx's circuit of capital and then he puts fossil fuels in the middle of it. And there are some diagrams, and you can even just go onto Google Images and look at the diagram. And what does he do? He drops into Marx's circuit of capital fossil fuels. Well, why is this significant? It's significant because it displaces, it ejects Marx's concept of circulating constant capital. We all know that constant capital involves machinery, but what most Marxists don't address is that Marx's constant capital also involves what he called circulating constant capital. This is straight out of volume 3, basically word for word, and that the dynamism of capitalist production leads to the underproduction of strategic raw materials, including, of course, fossil fuels, but not limited to that. And the history of capitalism, in fact, is such that every great wave of expansion ends with something that economists call a commodity boom or the rising prices of basic commodities. We saw this in the late 19th century. We saw it in the 1970s, and I've written quite a bit about this. This is basic economic history. But if we don't have Marx's concept of circulating, not the circulation of capital, but constant circulating capital, that's Marx's concept is a labor concept of natural resources and raw materials, of energy and raw materials. All of the categories of capital relate to the class struggle. They are the economic dynamics of capital expressed, or the class struggle dynamics of capital expressed through economic categories. And so Malm does something analogous to what Foster does with metabolism in displacing the analytical centrality of specific labor power. Most of my work has therefore been centered on what Raymond Williams once described as mixing labor with the earth and taking seriously the labor history of capitalism as mixed with the earth. Now, what's surprising, and your audience will be forgiven if they don't know this about me because the critics have so distorted what I've done, but that much of my scholarly life has been taken up writing labor history and looking at how labor processes are environment making activities that are at once produced and producing webs of life, from industrial factories and landscapes to sugar plantations to silver mines to the forests and fields of 16th and 17th century Poland. These constitute a labor metabolic approach that emphasizes the historically concrete forms of labor mobilization under capitalism. If we don't have an environmental history and a concept of social metabolism that foregrounds the labor relations and therefore the class relations of the web of life, then I know I sound like a broken record. Our vision for socialism will be one-sided and we will make fundamental mistakes that we do not have to. We will make mistakes, but this is one way. This is why, from Marx, praxis isn't just about the present moment. Praxis is also about retrodiction. It is about the historical interpretation. And those two moments of praxis, the history and then the history of the present, must fit together for an effective revolutionary strategy.
Okay, then maybe let's take a look at this vision of socialism that can come out of this type of thinking. I have a couple of questions that I titled Socialist Construction and the Web of Life, because I'm extremely curious to hear what your proposed change in perspective, what you call the world-ecology paradigm, what this brings about when we look beyond critique and think about construction. Let's maybe start quite broadly with what you call the double internality, but this time in socialism, because you use the term double internality to signify that capitalism works through nature and nature works through capitalism. Capitalism is, as you state, a way of organizing nature. Now, what could this relation look like under a desirable socialism? When it came to how they made cheap nature work, the real existing socialisms didn't really differ that much from capitalism. So there is obviously a need to be for a fundamental change with regard to how this double internality is structured within a desirable socialism. What could that look like?
Well, let's remember that socialism is a transitional stage. A transitional stage to what? Well, to the abolition of class society, of communism. Of course, bourgeois thinkers and even many socialists and leftists dismiss that as a fantasy. That socialism is itself a political project and hypothetically an era of transition in which class struggle is alive and well. That actually existing socialisms were indeed socialist. And the bourgeois position, which has been adopted by much of the left, is that, well, you know, they were all the same. They were emphatically not the same. And I'll try to explain why. However, it is absolutely certain and clear empirically that the Soviet Union and other state socialist projects were not outside of capitalism. Organizing a revolution, seizing state power, hoisting the red flag, these do not hermetically seal you from the contradictions of capitalism. And of course, we know this, that at the moment of the October Revolution, we see immediately the new Soviet Union invaded by 14 imperialist countries, including the United States and Great Britain and France and many others. And this meant that the continuation of World War I, even though the Bolsheviks conclude peace, extends into essentially the middle of the 1920s with probably 10 million dead. This is the estimate of Jonathan Smele in his very important history of the period. That's absolutely crucial to understand, since the imperialist forces, if they could not destroy socialism, were committed to the destruction of the forces of production within social spaces. This is clear again and again and again. The destruction of North Korea is another good example. The destruction of Vietnam is another example. We can go on down the list. Because if there's one group of people in the world who knows that socialism works, it's the bourgeoisie. That's why any little tiny whiff or of socialism that comes in is met with invasion and chemical warfare and bombing and death squads and economic strangulation and everything else. So the socialist projects were indeed real socialism. The analogy that I like to, or the parallel I like to draw is that labor unions within capitalist society often absorb the contradictions of capitalist society writ large. They are affected by the problems of bureaucratization, of all sorts of pathologies that culminate in what's called, at least in the United States, business unionism. So they abandoned the class struggle, et cetera, et cetera. I think that if we look at the history of the Soviet Union, we end up with a much more nuanced and complex and rich picture of its accomplishments and of its environmental history. Indeed, the position adopted by most of the eco-socialist left and the academic critical left as well, that the Soviets were no different from the rest of capitalism, is absolutely false. And the picture of a new generation of environmental historians of the Soviet Union paints a much richer and complex picture. For those who are curious, I recommend Salvador Engel de Moro's book, Socialist States and the Environment. It's not a great title, but it's a really important book, and he walks through all of these elements. There are many caricatures of these socialist projects. At the core of what they were seeking to do, often quite successfully against ferocious imperialist destruction. I mean, think of the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, in which the greatest, largest, and most mechanized army in human history invaded the Soviet Union to destroy its socialist project. As we know, it was the Red Army that smashed Nazism and therefore delivered the 20th century's greatest and signal contribution to human well-being and the well-being of the rest of the planet. 20 million Slavic peoples dead in that period, in addition to all of the other genocides and holocausts that occurred. So I think that the first thing we need to do when we look at the history of socialism is to look at the history of socialism and to avoid being suckered into the Cold War mythos of Soviet ecocide. Were there environmental problems in the Soviet Union? Yes, of course there were. They were deep contradictions. There's no question about that. Was it the same as the capitalist West? No, indeed. And if you doubt me, just go and look, first of all, at all of the sacrifice zones within the United States. Go to Hanford on the Columbian River. Go to Nevada. Go to the Salton Sea. And then go all the way around the world to all of the places that the U.S. devastated. Nobody ever says that, oh, capitalism is terrible because they committed ecocide in Vietnam and waged chemical warfare in Vietnam, and probably waged biological warfare, by the way, in the Korean War. And so we have to really take these dynamics seriously and understand the contradictions that are in play. What did the socialist states do that was correct? And here is where I want to get to the nub of your question. They pursued what Samir Amin called delinking. They were not autonomous, and the Soviets in particular industrialized by buying German machinery, German capital goods in the 20s and 30s, and then following the American Fordist blueprint. And why did they do that? Because they knew the German threat was coming. They knew the German threat was coming, and indeed the Imperial West rearmed and financed Germany over this period, and people can go into the weeds on this. But the Bank of International Settlements, supposedly constructed to help Germany deal with reparations, was in fact a crucial instrument of financing German fascism. And the West always hoped that a rearmed and remilitarized Germany would turn against Russia, which it did. And if the imperialist West gets its way, it will do once again today. Only that's going to end even more disastrously. So what Samir Amin argued with delinking was the popular mobilization, popular priorities, and defying imperial capital to actually develop states in the third world. And Russia was very much in the third world. It was, along with Mexico, one of the original third world not socialist in the case of Mexico, but social revolutions. We want to then go to the history of socialism and see what they did and see what they succeeded in doing, and seeing where the contradictions and the mistakes lay. However, we cannot, and it would be unreasonable on the basis of that empirical historical record, to dismiss the accomplishments of for beginners, the People's Republic of China, the Soviet Union, Vietnam, Cuba, many other places in the world who were sabotaged, destroyed, undermined at every step of the way. And that's crucial to developing a socialist imaginary for the 21st century. A socialism that cannot survive against the imperial West counter-revolution is a socialism that goes absolutely nowhere.
Unfortunately, this is absolutely true. I would like to dig a little bit deeper into this question of how one could go about when thinking socialism as a way of organizing nature. And I would like to dig a little bit deeper into what might be titled a form of metapolitics of measurement, because you argue that non-human work should be taken into account. And I did quite a couple of interviews in the context of Future Histories on democratic economic planning. And there you will often encounter proposals for a form of socialist accounting. And this is, of course, quite important because we will need some form of accounting. And the most advanced ones are using material and energy flow accounting, which, of course, includes human labor time. And people are also working on including care work and the reproductive sector more broadly into these methods of accounting. However, these proposals, at least so far, fall short of including non-human work, but basically more or less continue to treat it as a form of resource when it comes to this accounting side of things, you know. And this does not mean that they don't care about these questions and what you would call the web of life, but it nonetheless inscribes a certain logic and reproduces a certain logic into the accounting mechanism itself. And I would love to hear your thoughts on this, because we, as I already said, we will surely need systems of measurement for socialist construction. However, it is, of course, a absolutely crucial question how these systems of measurements are brought about, what boundaries they bring about, and how they produce the objects that they are measuring, actually. And one might say we need alternative metapolitics of measurement, I would argue. And the question of how non-human work can be accounted within these alternative ways of measurements is, I think, a good example to discuss what these politics of measurements might be about. So
it's a fantastic question, and I've spent a lot of time writing about science, about the politics of measurement. Witold Kula, the great Polish Marxist economic historian, called them metrical revolutions. Of course, Max Weber sarcastically spoke of the European rationality of world domination. Sombart famously advanced the thesis of double entry bookkeeping as central to the rise of capitalism. He was, if overstated, he was basically correct that in order to develop capitalism, there must be a quantitative revolution unprecedented in the history of class society. Of course, Europeans did not invent higher level math. They did not invent the decimal. They simply borrowed it from the more advanced regions of Eurasia, the Middle East, and South Asia in particular. Nevertheless, that expression, time is money, that we get from Ben Franklin and many other people is absolutely true. That measurement is fundamental. It is a fundamental software to capitalist managerialism. Now, in the question of socialist planning and socialist calculation, therefore, is absolutely crucial that any socialist project will have to reinvent science. And there's a term that eco-socialists don't like to use, which is proletarian science, because it sounds very quaint and old-fashioned, but I think it really cuts to the heart. The standpoint of the proletariat, as I've argued, is the standpoint of the proletariat in the web of life. And as we've been talking about, it's not only biological humans who work, but it's also soils, it's forests, it's plants who work. Now I could just hear the critic, oh, Moore is saying it's all the same. I'm not saying it's all the same. This is a differentiated unity. It is a rich totality of many determinations, as Marx would like to say. But we are deluding ourselves if we think that a socialist calculation of labor alienated, and I use that word precisely, alienated from webs of life, from non-human webs of life, if we think that we can have a meaningful socialist calculus that would facilitate democratic planning. We cannot, that must incorporate, as you are indicating, the web of life. Now, of course, bourgeois science has a way of mapping, monitoring, surveilling the web of life, the biospheric web of life. And indeed, the planet is ringed by a surveillance infrastructure that allows for the monitoring of pretty much every square meter of the planet. This should send chills down our spine because this is not to help all of us. This is to help the planetary superclass map and dominate the planet. Of course, that's being unsettled now by the rise of China and the BRICS, and we can get into that. However, this that at the core of so much of environmentalist and even so much of eco-socialist thought is an uncritical adoption of bourgeois science. And this goes to so we take something like ecosystem services, which is pioneered by people like Robert Costanza and others, or ecological footprint analyses pioneered by Matthias Wackernagel, both of which are total neoclassical, neoliberal approaches, by the way. It stuns me to see leftists endorsing these. But these are very, very narrow, one-sided ways of coming to terms with a higher synthesis, a higher needed synthesis of socialism and a socialist calculation. They're not headed towards that higher synthesis, but we should. And that means that we would have to rethink and reinvent capitalism's quantism, its quantitativism, its drive to turn everything into a number and then construct class rule on the basis of those numbers rather than on the basis of a socialist and democratic planning, which would of necessity admit the dialectical possibilities of what I mentioned earlier of cooperation, that a socialist agriculture would be based on cooperation between human labor, the climate patterns of the biosphere, and the work of the soils and the streams and the plants and everything, and the animals, the non-human animals and everything else. That's not a warm and fuzzy kumbaya countercultural claim. It says the question of the dignity and emancipation of labor is related to the dignity and emancipation of the rest of life. Not for nothing, Marx quotes the communist priest, Thomas Munzer, in The Jewish Question. The creatures too must become free.
I absolutely agree, but I would be extremely happy about some concrete examples with regard to how one might go about this challenge. Because, I mean, it's not only that with regard to reinventing a form of proletarian science, it's not only that one would need to think about forms of education and self-education that brings people into the position from which they can address these questions through the lens of web of life. That is one thing.
Precisely.
But then we would also have to develop concrete mechanisms, concrete social technologies and other technologies through which this form of measurement can be brought about. So maybe if you could give us an example for a way of measurement where you would say it is not only addressing these quantitative layers, but at the same time, maybe through additional mechanisms, able to bring in the quality of relations that is underneath all of these questions and that needs to be taken into account through some form of mechanism as well. So do you have best practices with regard to this?
Well, first of all, one would need to build a socialism that could successfully smash the imperialist forces in order to do that. So really,
That's
you would
the
need
first
to build,
step.
you would need to build a whole society. Well, look at the United States today. The United States cannot wage a war longer than 2 weeks. It doesn't have the material base for it. It doesn't have the soldiers healthy enough to do it. All it can do is launch these bombing campaigns. And guess what? All those F-35s, they each one has 900 pounds of rare earth minerals that are sourced from, wait for it, the People's Republic of China. So that's not a pipe dream, but there are fragments, there are elements, there are what anarchists and communists and socialists would call prefigurative elements. And a case in point is a broadly defined agroecology movement, especially but not only across the Americas, emphasizing peer-to-peer learning, um, um, looking at ways to advance agricultural productivity through a cooperative framework, not only between humans, but between humans and the rest of life, and experimenting with various polycultures instead of strict monocultures. And yet, like the problem with socialist transition in general, it occurs within the violence and domination and exploitation of capitalism. So the possibilities for extending those models are necessarily limited. And look at how capitalism itself built these agricultural models, something on which I've written quite a bit for a very long time. It built them through great imperial botanical institutions like the Kew Gardens in Britain in the 19th century and the Green Revolution institutions of American imperialism after World War II. It built great research universities to pursue agriculture. It constructed vast state programs to direct agriculture in a cash crop direction. It mobilized the power of the state to suppress agrarian dissent. So these dynamics take time to develop, and yet we can see agriculture and food justice, broadly conceived, of course, there are contradictions there, are emphatically pioneering modes of cooperation in agriculture that would mix the qualitative and the quantitative. And to go with your point, the arguments for proletarian science in the early 20th century were fundamentally of a piece with arguments for the building of proletarian culture. And this is hugely important. We can dismiss socialist experiments, but we do so at our peril. And many of them did, in fact, cultivate mass mobilization campaigns around popular priorities. This is hugely important. We can mock the Stakhanovites in the 1930s Russia, but the fact is that under Stalin's leadership, the Soviet Union built an industrial base, built an army, and built a state that did not collapse under the brunt of Nazi invasion, which was the whole project. And we can look back and should look back and be critical about various elements of that experience. I'm not suggesting that we whitewash the past or redwash the past, as the case may be. However, we cannot just ignore it. So why were the particular forms of socialist calculation what they were? And that cannot be abstracted from imperialism and counter-revolution and total genocidal war.
And to be very specific about it, would you say that something like material and energy flow accounting could, in the hands of a socialist proletarian science, could be an element of these measurements and forms of accounting if one goes about these questions in a way that does not kind of fall into traps of universalizing either one unit of account into the ultima ratio of everything, or falling into the trap of thinking in, with, and through nature with a capital N, as you criticized before. Would you think that these forms of technologies, these forms of measurements, which are coming out of capitalism for sure, but might nonetheless be an element of the broader answers and approaches that we might use to go forward?
Oh, of course. Of course, there's no question. So take a deeply problematic tendency in the history of post-war capitalism, the cybernetics revolution. And the
Right.
cybernetics revolution was part and parcel of the birth of Earth system science, itself an imperialist project led by the Americans, as Paracelsus has detailed in his wonderful book. Cybernetics was about the management of the planet, about the management of labor, about the management of war.
Right.
However, as we know from the experience of Salvador Allende's Chile, Cybernetics could also be used to coordinate under socialist planning. The Soviets missed a magic opportunity. Right around 1960, there was a proposal in front of the vice premier at the time to move the Soviet Union to a wholly cashless society, which it would
Mm.
have been done by regional computing centers that were networked. And there's no question that would have been a huge boon to socialist planning. So, yes, of course, this is Marx's argument about capitalism. He says we don't destroy everything, we don't leave behind what capitalism gives us. We take the elements of capitalist potential and rework them and reinvent them for popular ends. And while a machine embodies the class relations of capitalism, that cuts both ways. So various knowledge systems like cybernetics, like Earth systems, like material flow analysis, could and should be reinvented and redeployed. I don't think there's any argument about that. However, today we should understand first the history of those tendencies because they are the history of capitalist managerialism,
Mm.
as is most of environmental thought, by the way.
Yes.
And we should understand that they would need to be redeployed and reinvented in some fundamental ways.
Right, absolutely. And I was also thinking if something like the labor movement wouldn't need to be rethought and reinvented in the light of your arguments for taking into account non-human work, because many have criticized that there sometimes seems to be a certain disconnect between parts of the ecologically minded left and forms of broader class politics, let's say. And so far, there hasn't really been a mass movement that successfully combines red and green thought in a very thorough manner, one might argue. And you argue for a politics of liberation for all life, which I really like as an expression, I have to say. And I would wholeheartedly agree with this, but this brings up a couple of open questions. For example, does this mean that if we speak of a labor movement, that this should include non-human labor as well? And what does this in turn mean for the effective layer of something like solidarity, for example? Because it's difficult enough to strengthen solidarity among human workers. It will be much more difficult if we ask everybody to truly feel solidary affection for, I don't know, like something like corn, for example. I wouldn't argue against this, but it's certainly a much more difficult project to bring about solidarity with regard to a liberation for all life. So how can such a politics of liberation for all life be at the center of a revolutionary mass movement, actually? How can it become an attractive offer and an appeal for radical left politics?
Well, that's a long run political program. And
Hmm.
so, as socialists and communists have long emphasized, there are transitional programs and then longer, middle, and long run revolutionary programs. Much of a full transformation of consciousness has to occur under a transitional era of socialism.
Hmm.
And it's very difficult to move beyond immediate revolutionary consciousness and the tasks of the immediate revolutionary movement. Here's the thing about most leftists today. They believe in every revolution except for the one that actually succeeds. And that there's a lot of, and in terms of this divide between the socialist movement, the labor movement, and the green movement, we have a problem in the definition of terms. So I know in Europe, there are many political parties that call themselves socialists that are about as socialist as the Democratic Party in the United States. And most environmental politics, the mainstream of environmental politics, and I include the green parties in this, in Western Europe and the United States, their demographic base is the professionals. Now, the professionals are, in a strict sense, wage workers. In fact,
Mhm.
they're the most proletarian of all the working class because you have the doctor and the engineer who are married to each other, and they can pretty much provide for all of their needs with cash. Not so they can pay for a housekeeper, they can pay for childcare, they can pay for all of their social needs, they can go out to eat if they want. But for the vast majority of the working class, it's a semi-proletarian existence. The professionals hate the rest of the working class. The pathology of the professional class, which is not a class but a cultural formation and a labor market, the pathologies of the professional class have gone furthest in the United States, of course, where you have the Democratic Party as an authoritarian, right-wing, warmongering operation. The Republicans are too, but it's more nuanced. The Democrats pretend that they're different. So the problem of a synthesis between the working class movement and the green movement are not simply about like, oh, like let's all just get along and pretend that we can have a Green New Deal. As we know, the Green New Deal in the United States and Europe's Green Deal, they're both scams. They're huge subsidies to capital. They're not doing anything. They play into all of the climate theater of the COP meetings. And what's going on is that you have these very specific and very, very powerful actors who are interested in a form of climate geoengineering and planetary eco-austerity associated with people like Gates and Jeff Bezos. They meet like Johann Rockstrom at the Potsdam Institute. He's always traveling to the World Economic Forum in Davos in January, giving talks about how, oh, let's continue business as usual, but, you know, we're going to respect planetary boundaries. So are there eco-socialists who in the labor movement? Are there eco-socialists in green politics? Yes. But I think what I've been arguing lately is an elaboration of what Naomi Klein, in one of her more insightful moments, argued over a decade ago in the book, This Changes Everything. She said, look, the problem of the climate crisis is fundamentally the crisis of liberal democracy, the inadequacy of bourgeois democracy, which was always an elitist, professional class, top-down affair, that if we want an actual resolution to the climate crisis, what do we need? We need real democracy. And I think that's where, if the Greens are serious, if the labor movement is serious, if socialists are serious, that's what we need to pursue. The radical democratization of what? Of savings and investment, of actual industrial policy. That's the first thing. And with it, maybe even more importantly, is end the fucking wars. And you see in places, as I know you know very well, the Green Party beating the drums for war to go to rearm NATO, an offensive military alliance in a terrifying replay of the 1930s. And of course, as I made this observation about the United States in different ways, of course, it's a global empire. Of course, it's been organizing forever wars. And you know who I never hear talk about the forever wars? I never hear eco-socialists talk about it. Sometimes, once in a while, you'll hear it, and certainly environmentalists don't. They want to pretend that the climate crisis is somehow totally separate from the greatest orgy of U.S. military interventionism in its history. Over 170 foreign military interventions since 1999. That's according to the Tufts University Military Interventions Project. So if we want to build a common agenda for workers, I would say anywhere in the world, but especially in Western Europe and North America, end the forever wars, democratize the economy, and end the austerity. And while we're at it, let's end the national security state, the deep state, the surveillance state, because we can't have democracy while these goons and spooks are basically running the war machines and the internal security apparatuses. I mean, you know this in Germany with the extraordinary crackdown on political speech on the left as well as the right.
And a sudden blowing of a certain pipeline also.
Right. Well, exactly. I mean, this is extraordinary that, and it's still not clear to me why it's in Germans' best interest to stay silent about the destruction of the pipeline. And where are all the environmentalists? Where are all the environmentalists? This is one of the greatest environmental disasters of the century. Needless to say, war has been central to environmental change, but even more than that, much of the crucial intellectual apparatus of environmentalism came from the war machine. So we were talking about cybernetics.
Mm,
Well, cybernetics and systems dynamics comes out of American nuclear war ambitions, and limits to growth has a direct and immediate lineage to that work, the work of Jay Forrester, amongst others, at MIT's Sloan School of Management. Now, that doesn't discredit everything they say, as we're talking about. As dialecticians, we can take the useful, we can take the baby and leave the bathwater. But
mm,
let's not pretend that environmental science is somehow an innocent. Environmental science, I mean, sciences of all kinds, geology, especially behind the Anthropocene, is the science most closely linked to
mm.
imperialism.
And I mean, a very much related question, specifically when you point out that we need to radically democratize the political sphere, the economic sphere, of course. A related question is then, of course, how to govern with the web of life, one might say. And when I say govern, I don't necessarily mean it in the traditional way, but maybe even in the sense of the conduct of conduct, to say it with a Foucauldian perspective, maybe. Currently, the approaches brought forward within the planning debate, they seem to promote notions of the human subject as the democratic sovereign when it comes to political questions. And this would crucially include what we now call the economy, of course, but it will still stick to this notion of the democratic subject as a sovereign somewhat. And when it comes to the planning debate, it also tends to promote ideas of what one might call full intelligibility and transparency in order to address questions of visibility, countability, and accountability as central elements of how one governs democratically. And now I would say there is a balancing act to approach here, I guess. On the one hand, I'm absolutely in favor of arguing for democratic planning as probably the core paradigm of political economies and political ecologies to come. However, I, at the same time, argue against simply falling back into this unquestioned paradigm of democratic sovereignty, including the underlying notion of the subject that comes with it. So I would kind of argue to be cautious with regard to that. And then, and we already kind of talked about this, the notion of encompassing control through visibility and full intelligibility is also not without problems. I mean, James C. Scott, for example, has worked on this. But here again, we have a sort of balancing act to master because we do not want to play into the hands of people who use this notion of unknowability in order to argue for example, market forces, as the Austrians famously did, as if we couldn't do anything else but to leave things to a quasi-metaphysical market because of questions of unknowability and so on. I think you know the argument. How can we think of desirable alternative arts of government that govern in, with, and through the web of life?
Well, first, the revolutions have to be defended and capital has to be euthanized. And so many of my problem with a lot of these discussions is two or threefold. One, it's carried on at a very high level of abstraction. It's carried on through thought abstractions, largely taken, as you implicitly suggest, from liberalism.
Mm-hmm.
The Democrat, what is the sovereign and individual? Well, the individual is a world historical creation of capitalism, and like everything else, we need to separate the baby and the bathwater. There's some good elements of that, and many antisocial and destructive elements of that, and also, like you said, there's an underlying Smithianism. You see in something called a subsistence perspective today, which I find to be, although there are many good people making this argument, an absolutely counter-revolutionary standpoint that romanticizes peasantries, that takes them out of, it's not dealing with actually existing peasantries, which had all sorts of problems, many virtues, but all sorts of problems. And it ignores Marx's and the communist vision of the full development of human potential.
Hmm.
I think that what we see, and indeed, so another part of the problem, which connects with everything I just said, is that most of these discussions are utopian in Marxist sense, not in the sense of utopian like let's imagine a future world, but in disconnecting from history. And a lot of what you just said is typifies what happened in the Soviet countryside in the 1920s, where there was a loosening of relations, there was a blossoming of market processes and empowerment of the kulak stratum of the peasantry. It wasn't all bad. It had many positive elements to it under the new economic program. And then once the terms of trade started to change in a major way towards the end of 1927 and 28, everybody in the Soviet Communist Party, Stalin and Trotsky totally agreed that there would have to be a crash course of industrialization if the revolution was to survive. So that speaks to the point I keep hammering that socialism is a transitional phase. And there's
Mm.
one group in the world that is absolutely threatened by socialism and absolutely knows something called democracy, something called real democracy or socialism could actually work. And it's the masters of the universe, the masters of mankind, as Adam Smith said. It is the planetary superclass represented by the imperial West. And they will go to destroy you. And really, their great fear is not
Mm.
even democracy in some generic sense; it's national self-determination. So why did the United States hate the Soviet Union so much? It was because it was independent and it couldn't be bullied. Why does the United States hate Iran so much? Because it is independent and is being bullied, but is not going to simply knuckle under American hegemony. Same with Venezuela and many, and indeed most of the global South. Most of the human population is now under U.S. sanctions, uh, and the great fear of imperialists is always self-determination. This is true for the British before the Americans. This is not true for the Chinese. I'm not trying to be romantic about Belt and Road, and it's not some warm and fuzzy socialism, but this is not the Chinese strategy. It is different. So, just to get to the point where we can talk about meaningful democracy is a very, very long, violent road. And we cannot minimize this. We have to look at what happened. Let's just look at what happened to Germany after World War II. Well, first of all, Dulles, the CIA director, takes Hitler's intelligence chief and makes him the West German intelligence chief. Meanwhile, the CIA is running a program. Everyone can go Google it. Operation Ohio, an assassination program to kill labor leaders, communists, socialists in the democratic Germany. So, what happens when there's a democratic upsurge? The deep state, which is a left wing concept, the deep state comes in and completely destabilizes the left. And this poses great and profound problems for socialist democracy in the transitional period. A routine condemnation of the Soviet Union is, well, they had a secret police. Well, you know why they had a secret police? Because the imperialists were and the counter-revolutionaries were trying to destroy the revolution, and this accounts for the internal security apparatuses of most of these socialist projects. I'm not trying to say they didn't have excesses; they certainly did. However, we see the threat of counter-revolution. Look at the JFK files recently released. Now we know emphatically the CIA was all over Hungary. The CIA and other elements of the American empire had been training counter-revolutionaries across this period. And if you want to understand what happened when the communists didn't take action, it was Greece in 1947, which was an absolute bloodbath. So here's the thing that I think, agree with me or disagree with me. I mean, your audience or you, Jan, it's all okay. But let's go to what actually happened and what are the actual problems with democracy. And one thing about the imperial West that we know emphatically, these are not democracies. These have never been democracies. They have ruling classes that absolutely fear working class democracy, popular democracy, and oh, by the way, they will repress, imprison, and murder you to stop any popular democracy. So this maybe frustrates the usual sort of, well, what would a democratic socialism look like? But then look at actually existing democratic socialism, which was neither democratic nor socialist, and you'll see how they were destabilized. Look at the Labor government under Wilson in 74 to 76, which, as widely reported in the British press, was subjected to a soft coup of the British intelligence services, the CIA, and the International Monetary Fund. This is very important to keep this history in mind because what is coming up is not going to be for professional class moralizers talking about just transitions and sustainable governance and all of this. This is going to be a real. Unfortunately, it is already bloody, and it will be more bloody. It will be more violent, not because of the popular forces, but because the powerful want to keep their power and their wealth.
Yes, Jason, that's true. It's also horrifying, to be honest.
It's less horrifying if we understand it. If we understand what actually happened, then
Right.
we can go in with clarity. And that's
Well,
what is missing on the left today.
yes, I agree with that. But there is the related question then is that if, as you point out, if there is a long and violent road, I think you said, how can we go about this task without this violence becoming internalized in a way such that what comes out of it is not really the stage from which a true communism can be brought about? Because arguably, if you have to be semi or fully authoritarian in the way that you run the revolution, or what will be have to be defended after the revolution, then you kind of plant a certain seed within the structures that should be designed in a way that they are able to bring about communism, but are somewhat stuck because of this authoritarian and violent element within it. And I do see this conundrum, because you are absolutely right that there will be forces that are going to try to crush everything that's like resembles some form of emancipatory revolutionary project whatsoever. I'm absolutely convinced of that. And you're right to point out all these different coups, all these historical examples for when people tried this and were crushed manifestly. I mean, even liberals like Kennedy, who famously said that he wants to shatter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and fired Alan Dulles.
And then they killed him.
And what?
And then they killed him. They
Yes.
killed him for it. Yeah.
Yes. And so even what one might say moderate liberal projects like that, who want to, for example, go out of Vietnam and end the Vietnam War and stuff like that, get crushed very brutally. So I do see this conundrum, but still one would have to find a way in which the whole project is not being corrupted through this violence and does not reproduce authoritarian structures again and again and again and again, because we will have to find a way to bring about communism, and I don't think it will come out of authoritarian structures. So
Well,
there is a certain...
we should take care not to reify authoritarian, and we should take care not to reify violence. Socialism, as one of my best friends likes to say, not as easy as it looks. It's not as easy as it sounds. It's not just like, oh, we're going to overthrow the bourgeoisie, well. And then we can all go on to our, collective farms and our bicycle co-ops and all this stuff. Yes, that's where we want to go. Okay. Yes, we all want to have this warm and fuzzy moment. The question is about how does one manage the contradictions. I think, again, there are fantastic historical lessons to this. The Chinese experience, again, is instructive without being romantic. When Mao is out of power in 1959, 1960, he studies, he comes back, and he calls for a cultural revolution against the party bureaucracy. Now, that's something exactly in line with your sympathies. It is to organize a mass movement of young people in that case, against the capitalist roaders, against people like Deng Xiaoping. Now, Deng Xiaoping later comes back and does some interesting things, but Mao was right. He was basically a capitalist roader, capitalism or socialism with Chinese characteristics or whatever they want to call that. Mao's concept of the mass line is incredibly instructive. That is, that there is a popular ongoing process of struggle, that the transition from socialism to communism is one of a continual and continuous class struggle. It's more or less a direct paraphrase. This was different from the Soviet experiment, but the Soviet experiment was itself a bit different because the fascists and the imperialists had killed approximately 38 million people between 1916 and 1945. And that had a major consequence on Soviet society, where the best and the brightest of the industrial working class were brought into managerial positions, were brought into the party leadership. And therefore, the proletarian cadres who would have stirred up trouble in another circumstance were not there. And this is just empirically true. If you look at the class basis of the Central Committee of the Soviet Union in the 1970s, you can see the vast majority came from the industrial working class. Well, so this is to say that these problems are not easy to address, especially when the imperialist nuclear arsenal is directed straight at you. And we've all seen, or you should go check out if you haven't seen, even today, the network of bases surrounding China.
Hmm.
And go look at the network of American bases. The United States is building new airfields um, as we speak to launch a nuclear war against China. That's not overstatement. This is what the Union of Concerned Scientists calls the doomsday clock, and guess what? It's worse than ever. So authoritarianism is not something to reify. It is a response to actual social historical conditions, and I think that's what a lot of this kind of easy posturing on the left forgets. This is what somebody like Andreas Malm says. Well, in 1928 there was a counter-revolution in the Soviet Union, and then it was Soviet fossil Stalinism or something. That's such an empty bullshit and counter-revolutionary way of looking at it. We should look at the real historical contradictions. And by the way, that as I mentioned, Malm is a Trotskyist, and Trotsky argued for the same political program. Indeed, it might have been even more brutal. So when we look at these situations, we should get out of the moralizing fairy tale playbook of the professional class left, the anti-communist left, and just look with sober eyes and to create balance sheets for these experiences. There are real experiences. And by the way, democracy doesn't always look like everyone going to the voting booth. It
Hmm.
looks like mass mobilization, popular mobilization as well. And that's something we have to keep in mind. And yet, again, looking at the 20th century world and evaluating these socialisms, I'm not saying we shouldn't draw pluses and minuses, that we shouldn't draw the pros and cons. We should. And we should also be aware that these were places where counter revolution, invasion, and nuclear threat was there from the beginning. In a very real sense, all actually existing communism was war communism or war socialism. Not in the Soviet Civil War sense, but in the sense that war was always, always, always there. If you want to understand North Korean authoritarianism, understand what the United States did to North Korea in the 1950s, including very, very likely biological warfare, including bombing practically every city into rubble. And that doesn't go away. Those sensibilities don't go away. So I think that that's what's missing, that we have to go back to history. It is a history of capitalism in the web of life. It is history of class struggles in the web of life. And we need the history, we need the class struggle, we need the web of life, and they are all dialectically joined to each other. We can't think one without the other. And all of those are fundamental to building out a revolutionary and properly socialist and, yes, democratic strategy for
Hmm.
transformation. But it will not come easy.
Hmm. Yeah, for sure. And I mean, I'm not sure if this is even answerable, but what does this mean for our political imaginaries and the narrative strategies that are tied to it? Because, for example, with regard to the notion of democracy and related questions of the demos, I mean, on the one hand, when you point out that one would need to think in with and through the web of life, on the one hand, one might think, okay, well, what does this mean for the question of the demos, for example? How can the non-human sensibly be included into the demos, or is that even desirable, or should there be a different form of sensing that is attached to these questions? How can one go about these questions in very practical terms? But then on the other hand, it seems as if you're arguing for a sort of pragmatic approach as well, where you're saying that, okay, these questions of the underlying relations within the web of life and how we get to a point of not only recognizing these relations, but being aware of the qualitative aspect of these relations in a very thorough manner, that this would need to be a long run project, more or less. And in the immediate term, one would need to be very pragmatic and also kind of power driven in his or their approach, So it seems as if what you're arguing for is a somewhat double-layered approach. But what does this mean with regard to questions of political imaginaries? Is there also a two-step approach with regard to that? Or would you put always in front already this, for example, notion of the web of life and the underlying relationality as well?
Well, it's a great question, and we always have to proceed from the actual reality that's in front of us. In order to make sense of that reality, we have to have a history. And as you say, there's a narrative struggle. So why did the Anthropocene, the Age of Man narrative come in when it did? Well, it came in when it did because it suited the interests of the powerful at the end of the Cold War. And why did climate emergency rhetoric come in basically from out of nowhere in 2018, 2019? Well, it was in response to an unprecedented wave of social unrest that was totally politically disunified. I mean, everywhere from Islamic political violence to mass strikes to the Yellow Vest movement to everything. So we have to look at the reality as it actually is. We need to be, as Lenin once said, as radical as reality itself. And that means we have to have a short run vision of what to do. I would say, first and foremost, we have to take the working classes of Western Europe and North America where they are at. And we have to look for the actual political agendas that put everyone together. And I can't speak for Western Europe, which I don't know as knowledgeably as I do of the United States. But in the United States, you have a mass working class constituency that is aligned against the security state, against the forever wars, for the expansion of real democracy, and against monopolies. And this extends from elements of the large elements of the MAGA coalition to the populist and even social democratic left. So where do we begin? We have to look at where the working class is in order to advance the politics. Now, to your question, there is a longer process of the transformation of consciousness. And in my view, Jung was absolutely right. There's a collective unconscious. It is not only a conscious that unifies humankind, but humankind with the rest of life. That indeed should be common sense for any revolutionary. It was common sense for countless peoples around the world. It is central to indigenous and other lifeways and cosmologies for hundreds of thousands of years on this planet before class society. So the notion that we are all one, the creatures too must go free, that we are all one, such that an injury to one is an injury to all, that while one part of life is enslaved and enchained, no one can be free. These are staples of the revolutionary critique over the centuries, and we should take it seriously. So that means also being, and this goes back to your question about, well, what do we take from bourgeois science? Well, quite a bit. But we don't need to take it as a new form of religion, a new sacred object. We want to take the science and the culture and the sense of collective unity, not just of humans, but of humans with all life. And seriously, we want to take the collective unconscious seriously. That has to be part of a communist project. However, not everyone is there, and that's okay. That has to be, if we believe that socialism is a transitional period characterized by a continual and continuous struggle, then it is necessarily also a struggle for emancipated and emancipatory consciousness that will necessarily find itself in many dead ends. It will go in the wrong direction because that's how we learn and we're allowed to learn. What imperialism has done to the socialist project is forced it into a survival mode. And we all know from our individual lives, if we've experienced trauma, we've experienced very dangerous situations, we go into a survival mode. One cannot thrive in a survival mode. And so I would suggest that we've only seen the glimpses of possibility of socialist emancipation from actually existing socialism. And yet those glimpses are important. Let's stop shitting on them.
And I mean, really very much related to this question of political imaginary, something I see popping up more and more and really gaining traction on the left is a narrative of collapse. Specifically in Germany, there is kind of a one might say even movement forming around this notion of collapse, and very much tied to narratives of kind of catastrophe and end fight, so to speak. I really don't like this approach, I have to say. And within Capitalism and the Web of Life, you analyze this as part of a Cartesian narrative, actually, and I'd like to quote you on this. And you say, the Cartesian narrative unfolds like this. Capitalism, or if one prefers modernity or industrial civilization, emerged out of nature. It drew wealth from nature. It disrupted, degraded, or defiled nature. And now, or sometime very soon, basically now, nature will exact its revenge. Catastrophe is coming. Collapse is on the horizon. End quote. So what's your stance on the rise of this collapse narrative? Certainly things are bad. That's true. That's the true part, I would say. And you yourself also argue that capitalism is in a terminal crisis, probably, because it's running out of cheap nature, basically. But this still seems to be something different from the collapse narrative that is gaining traction in these days.
Collapse is a neo-Malthusian construct. So it comes out of the reinvention of Malthus's thinking after World War II, and then especially in the late 1960s with people like Paul Ehrlich, environmental neo-Malthusianism. And it's grown since then. There are, I should say, very good scholars like Joe Tainter who write about collapse, and they have many contributions to make. However, collapse is a neo-Malthusian narrative. Collapse, catastrophism, environmentalism is essentially a form of elite or professional class millenarianism. That is a form of seeing the end time, seeing a new salvation coming. For the fundamentalist Christians, they have the rapture where God comes and plucks you out of the airplane at the moment of rapture and leaves all the sinners to repent. So we're dealing with a millenarian worldview. This has been nurtured and redeveloped around nature. It's a form of nature worship since the early 1970s. Actually, a great German thinker, Hans Magnus Enzensberger, wrote a famous piece called Two Ends of the World, and in New Left Review in 1978. It's worth a read. We want to take great care and apply great skepticism to pronouncements of existential threat, collapse, climate emergency, because these are rhetorically arguments for a kind of green technocratic scientific fascism. Calls for climate emergency are rhetorically calls for the actual application of emergency rule. In Germany, you know the dangers of this very well. Apparently, it doesn't stop German Greens from using this language. Unfortunately, climate change is very serious. Don't let anyone misunderstand. People are like, oh, Moore says climate change isn't real. No, climate change is very real. It's very serious. It's a big fucking deal. Okay. Uh, it is not, however, an existential threat. Even James Hansen, who wrote a very provocative book in 2009 called Storms of My Grandchildren, he has this terrifying chapter called the Venus Syndrome, that Earth could become captive to a feedback loop that would lead to the Earth becoming Venus. He comes back about 4 years later in 2013 and he says, well, that's actually was extreme. You would have to dig up all the fossil fuels on the planet in a very, very short period of time, a couple centuries, for that even to be a remote possibility. Okay. So we know that climate change is not an existential threat. And therefore we know that claims for climate emergency are absolutely bogus and arguments for collapse are deeply problematic. You should ask, why are all of those ideas circulating? When did they begin to circulate? And who's bankrolling them? So climate emergency rhetoric very much comes in at a moment of, as I mentioned, a profound social unrest across the world, and then it's introduced, and it's very interesting if you look at a map of climate emergency declarations. They're basically in the least affected parts of the world. They're in the richest, the most powerful, and the least affected, still affected, but least affected parts of the world. They're places like Scotland. And okay, Scotland's going to be affected by climate change, but they're not facing an existential threat. So there's something going on beyond like, oh my God, the climate is going to kill us all. So we have to begin to look very critically at the ways that environmentalist discourse has served the powerful, how it's been related to actual policies that have served the rich and powerful. And most on the left pretend that green politics is somehow left wing. It's not. It can be, but its major forms, its dominant forms in Western Europe and North America have absolutely been a continuation with different characteristics of an older elite driven environmentalism. That's climate collapse. Climate collapse is fear mongering. And by the way, if the collapse in question is actually the collapse of this predatory exploitative system we call capitalism, great. That's a good thing. However, most of the time, civilizations don't collapse. They morph into something different. And I prefer crisis because it's more clear. A crisis is a transition point. A crisis is a bifurcation point where there's a qualitative shift or transition from one mode of producing power, profit, life to another. Let's talk about crisis and transition. Then we can talk about socialist politics, and we don't need the fear mongering.
And would you say that because of the specific nature of the overall crisis, namely that you argue that capitalism is running out of cheap nature, would you say that because of this specific nature of the crisis, we are at a point that actually opens up certain possibilities in a way that weren't there before?
No question about it. The combination of the wars, climate crisis, of austerity across the global north, not to mention elsewhere, the building out of the police state, the crisis of liberal democracy, these are all dialectically joined. They're all trying to contain an underlying problem, which is that capitalism has frozen the living standards of the vast majority of people across the global north for the past 50 years if you're in the United States, maybe 30, 35 years if you're in Germany. And of course, it's wildly and unevenly distributed. But there is an underlying crisis. You saw this in the recent German elections where the voters for the Green Party were like, no, it's no problem if we have to pay more for basic goods. Most of the working class, which did not vote for Die Linke and did not vote for the Greens, said, fuck you, the price of groceries is too damn high. This is happening in the United States. So this is, of course, the dynamics of inflation are not merely ecological scarcity or not even primarily. They're also because the central dynamic of capitalism, its competitive dynamic, is now terminated. There's no meaningful competition amongst major capitalist entities today. Most major strategic economic sectors are dominated by 4 or 5 corporations, media, um, steel making. Look at all these tech. Certainly, they're all hyper monopolized beyond the wildest fantasies of Luxembourg and Lenin and everyone else before World War One. It's monopoly capitalism on steroids. In the United States, at least, the top 500 companies, I think 85% of them, the largest stockholder is BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard. These massive passive, so-called passive index firms, all valued at all managing assets over $10 trillion. It's incredible. So is this capitalism? Well, capitalism has to have competition. So I think in a real sense that capitalism has already been terminated, and this is what's behind the techno-feudalism discourse. I don't agree with the particulars of it, but the spirit of it is right. There's generally a move from an economic competition model to a political accumulation model. And Beijing has a different model for this. Washington, NATO, Europe has a different model for it. But it is a fundamental epical transition. People are still talking about capitalism like that's a real thing. No, I'm sorry. Put a fork in it. Capitalism is done.
Wow, that's a statement. You already mentioned and criticized heavily the mainstream environmentalism. I wanted to get back to this question of boundaries. I think you mentioned Rockström at some point, and I would like to hear your opinion about this question of boundaries, because within the democratic planning debate, for example, there is also a form of reliance on this notion of boundaries in order to provide some framework for where we are going and what would be a desirable way of enacting a future democratic planned society. So I would be curious to hear your opinion about maybe the proclamation of boundaries vis-a-vis the real existing limits. These are maybe two different things.
Well, of course, there are planetary boundaries, and I have no fundamental difference with Rockström on that specific point. Of course, and I wrote Capitalism and the Web of Life about the actual limits to capitalism, which are different from planetary boundaries. And from limits to growth to planetary boundaries, the key move is to conflate the two. And I'm more concerned with how planetary boundaries is used and how Rockström in particular uses it. One of my favorite examples, Rockström is a complete scumbag. Okay. And I have no problem saying this publicly. Let me give you a great example of this. He's the chief scientist for one of the largest and richest environmental NGOs in the world called Conservation International. And Conservation International has long been known amongst international justice advocates as a greenwasher, greenwashing Shell, the oil company, Monsanto, a chemical weapons manufacturer. And then also the Ecologist magazine sent undercover journalists to approach Conservation International to do some good public relations work for an arms manufacturer. And Conservation International is like, oh, this is great. Conservation International is in league with another outfit that Rockström also is associated with called the Earth League. Have you heard of the Earth League? No. This is a group. Everyone can go and Google it, like all these other outfits that identify. It promotes itself as a consortium of ex-intelligence officers and other paramilitary mercenary outfits who go around the world to be kind of Avengers-like cops for conservationism. It's completely disgusting. You can go and check out Rockström, who talks at Davos. He's friends with Hans Vesterberg of Verizon, talking about, planetary boundaries shouldn't be understood as anti-capitalist at all, that we need business. And we need to continue the way of business. He publishes with the World Economic Forum on its website with some frequency. And this is an example of basically the elitist and quasi-totalitarian character of some kinds of science in the present moment, and certainly the outlooks of scientists. So this is somebody who is a master. Rockström is a master of Orwellian doublespeak. And you can look at it. He published a piece last year in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences talking about a new paradigm about planetary commons. And you know what his one empirical example is? It is this public-private neoliberal partnership, something like the ocean stewardship of big fish trawlers. Uh, and they neglect to point out that it was, he was in the midst of through the Stockholm Resilience Center of helping to organize this and all this. So again, so the solution, the new paradigm for dealing with planetary boundaries is a kind of one world government in which public-private partnerships will dominate. And public-private basically means a bunch of elite scientists with a bunch of big corporations.
I see. So that means there is room for the notion of boundaries, but used in a different way.
The boundaries are absolutely real. This is a problem that goes back to the Limits to Growth report in 1972. The Limits to Growth report and the Stockholm Environmental Conference were specifically a response by the Imperial West to contain the third world threat. And this is the use to which the Rockstrom planetary boundaries framework is put. And if you wonder more about that, you think, oh, Moore is exaggerating, just go and look at the Davos and aligned institutions like the Club of Rome and the Trilateral Commission and all of these, the Earth Commission, all of these outfits. And they're basically looking for ways to contain the rise of the global south and to enforce climate eco-austerity on everyone. And the fact is that the only people who need eco-austerity are people like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk. Um, and of course, as we've established, we know where their bank accounts are. We know this from the Panama Papers, right? I mean, the imperialists in the West are happy to freeze the accounts of Russian billionaires. I have no problem with that. Whenever billionaires get their assets frozen, great. Well, we know it can be done. So now let's go and do that to Elon Musk and all of the sort of criminal gangster class that runs the states of the Imperial West, and go after them, go after their bank accounts. They have names and addresses. Um, they didn't earn that money. We earn that money. So that's what we have to look at. We have to look at how the science. I call it good science in a very sarcastic way. Good science is the best science that money can buy. And there are, of course, many valiant, courageous, independent minded climate scientists here. So I'm definitely not trying to tar them with the Rockstrom brush. But Rockstrom is a big target. And he has gone out of his way to give, he gives interviews to The Guardian saying, well, tree huggers and frontier activists, that's fine. You can just hear the contempt dripping off the page. But really, he says, because we're out of time, we need to align with the bankers and the CEOs. That's a direct quote from the Guardian interview in 2021.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so unfortunately, we are not yet in the position to freeze the bank accounts of the oligarch class.
Not yet.
So what would you say are the most effective levers through which a much needed revolution can be brought about?
Well, it's regionally and nationally specific. And I don't want to venture too far out of my area of expertise. In the United States, however, I can say emphatically what you see in the United States is a profound popular supermajority against wars, including against the American-Israeli genocide in Gaza. That this is the mass, and this includes the majority of so-called MAGA under Trump. The MAGA base is absolutely furious around the bombing of Iran, as well they should be. And it's also true that there is among the working class, from the populist right and the populist left, a very strong anti-monopoly sentiment. So, for instance, Steve Bannon, the key architect of Trump's political ascendancy, is in alignment with the antitrust head of the Federal Trade Commission, Lena Khan. Massive public support for breaking up the monopolies, especially the tech monopolies. The tech monopolies are, of course, part of the American deep state. And I just have to keep saying this. Deep state is a left-wing concept. It comes out of Turkish political scientists. It's been popularized by the left-wing political thinker Peter Dale Scott, Aaron Good, and others. Massive outrage at the deep state. Again, populist left and populist right, furious at the deep state. If you doubt this, go and look at the mass outrage in Trump's base around the Epstein files. So mass outrage against the Epstein files. So what do we have so far? Against the war machine, against the deep state, against monopolies. There will be different specifics in different parts of the world. However, for revolutionaries, we don't pick and choose the working class that we want to work with. We don't say, well, did you vote for Trump? Are you a transphobe? Are you this? Are you that? Are you, where do you land on immigration? You look for the core areas of agreement and you proceed on that basis. Of course, as communists have always done, you raise the wider questions in a continuous manner. And this is the case in American communism, that American communists forged black-white, multiracial working class unity across their era of greatest success in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. This is where we have to begin. Instead of beginning with that preachy, fairy tale, moralizing political program of an imagined fantasy working class, we have to take working people where they are. And you know what? We might be surprised. I will tell you straight up that I live in a working class neighborhood. I grew up in the American working class, and my working class friends in my neighborhood are much more politically astute than 98% of my academic colleagues, and 99% or more of the professionals that I encounter. So this is another part of the process. That in so many places in the world, the left is dominated by the professionals class. And frankly, that's been an absolute disaster.
Jason, there's a last question that I always ask, and it is, if you think about the future, what makes you joyful?
What makes me joyful? Seeing that despite the drive towards totalitarianism in places like the United States and Western Europe over the past 5 years, 6 years, we can take that longer, and I've been writing a lot about this. We see the ferment and the turbulence and the outrage, and you know what? The common sense, the vast majority, keeps breaking out and keeps breaking through. That this kind of administrative, technocratic, religious-like belief in bourgeois science, all of this that has percolated and permeated across professional classes really has increasingly little traction in recent years. And I believe that across the imperial West, people are waking up. The working classes especially are sick of the wars. And this is tremendously heartening to me. Now, it's true, Trump ran on an anti-war platform and has completely betrayed his platform. He's completely betrayed his popular base. And it's terrible because of the bombing, because of the continuing genocide, because of the continuing arms shipment. That's terrible. But why it's good is that his base is not going along with him. And what should terrify us in the imperial West is the destruction of a peace movement. I grew up around the anti-nuclear movement, around nuclear disarmament, around solidarity with the peoples of El Salvador and across the third world. All of those movements were systematically destroyed in the United States. And pretty much were destroyed across Western Europe too, in various, maybe not as great, but still. So, and yet the peace movement keeps coming back, and it doesn't always look the way that we want it to. The people who want an end to the forever wars are not necessarily going to hold the full spectrum of virtuous political positions that professional class leftists want them to. But that is a point of agreement and some place where we can continue to build and develop and spread a new consciousness, a more emancipatory one, a more inclusive one, a more egalitarian one. And at every step, that has to involve a connection with webs of life.
Jason, thank you so much for being part of Future Histories.
It's been a pleasure, Jan. Thank you for a great conversation.
That was our show for today. Thanks a lot for listening. If you want to support Future Histories, you can do so on Patreon. For this, visit patreon.com/futurehistories, or you can simply tell a friend that you liked the show and that he, she, or they might like it as well. Thanks a lot, and hear you in 2 weeks.